So I should change the order of these first two slides. But so yeah, this is essentially how I got to where I am, which is I've been doing full-time development for about 2.5 years now, having started in a series of support orgs. So what I'm going to cover here is how I went through this path, some mistakes that I made or some pitfalls that I hit, and a few things I learned and would encourage y'all to emulate. First, we need a little bit of a caveat on any talk like this, which is to say that bias absolutely happens in the hiring and promotion process. And if you feel that one of the things that has been holding you back in your career development is bias, that's likely true. And I don't have a fix for that, but I would also say that if you're the target of bias, it's not actually your problem to solve. It is your problem, right? It's a problem that affects you, but the solutions are not going to come from you acting differently. So, as somebody who benefits generally from bias, it's the responsibility of myself and people like me to try and resolve it. But so this talk is not going to offer solutions to that stuff, because obviously I don't have great solutions to that stuff. Anywho, so yeah, my path, some pitfalls, some stuff that I learned. So as I was doing this talk, I was trying to find placeholder images, and Keynote was just like, "Do you want to use your photo roll to do something?" I was like, "I absolutely do." So this is Max, so let's talk about. I'm going to go through my jobs in order and go over some of the things that I learned within each one, and then go over some of the kind of takeaways that I think we have. So let's start where we start. I had graduated college. I'd gone and lived overseas for a while. I came back and got my first sort of real job, which was doing phone tech support for a company called Learning.com here in town. So I made, I think at peak, 45K. It was probably more like 43K or something. I got good benefits. I got to work from home a day or two a week. I didn't have to work that hard, either when I was working from home or in general. And that was sort of where it stood out on how it benefited me personally. While working there, I saw that I wanted to do something that was a little more technical and complex, and mainly at the time, not because I wanted more money or because I wanted advancement, but just because I was bored. And here's the stuff I tried that did not work well, which was trying to do front-end programming on my own. And that was largely directionless and didn't come back with a lot of benefits to me day to day. I would try to take on small development tasks around my role professionally, and also try to do stuff that I thought was interesting. And it was, I'd be working on something for 8 or 9 weeks and not have a lot to show for it. So that was not that super. And here's the big thing that I learned from that, which is that when you set out to teach yourself something, and that's the first time that you've ever tried to learn something that way, the actual subject matter is not the problem that you have. It can be as complex or simple as you like. The big problem that you're going to have is actually having some kind of motivation and direction to do that learning. Here's what did work while I was there, which is that I got help. I went and talked to my doctor and I said, you know what, I think I need to handle this. That was a huge change in my life. Again, not talking about trying to solve bias, but when I was a kid, there were whole books written that said, why are women so less affected by ADHD than men? And I'll tell you the reality, that it turned out that sort of did not occur. I mean, this was people's serious topic of research. They were looking for genetic markers, and they weren't looking for the fact that if you had a woman who was 15 years old, you'd be like, oh yeah, she's not good at school, that's fine, right? And if you had a young man who was like, yeah, he can't do his schoolwork, you'd be like, that's a problem that we need to solve. So in general now, the diagnosis rate is about the same. If you feel like you cannot complete a task, if you feel like you can set out a project that goes for about 12 hours, takes about 12 hours of work, and it takes you 9 weeks to finish that project, then you may want to look into that. So the second job that I got was at Relic doing essentially email support, and that was just a result of having sort of general feelers out looking for a job. I didn't actually put up a slide about this, but in my experience, right, the pace of the tech sector is such that your job search really should not stop, right? There shouldn't be a point that you say, okay, I'm not looking for a job. You're not actively looking for a job, right? But the job I found at New Relic was the result of some kind of targeted LinkedIn ad. And it was because I was maintaining that stuff despite being perfectly happy at my job. I think I'd been recently promoted while I was at learning.com, right when I saw this New Relic thing. So New Relic, I went from about 65K to about 80K by the time I left. I had to work very closely with developers, and something happened to me which will never ever happen to you, which is that my stock options actually paid out that I got when I started. And I'll guarantee you that will never ever happen. I still sort of believe that I don't have that money. Because yeah, stock options never pay out, but it happened this one time. So New Relic was great. I tried a few things there that did not work super well. In general, I tried to move within New Relic from support into development. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in that third point. The other thing I did was I learned definitely 6 different programming languages, and I'll give you an example of how that went. About 2 years after that, I was applying for a role where I would do some Angular programming, and as a refresher, I was like, I've never written Angular before, but it's a JavaScript framework, it's front end, I think I can figure it out. Oh, there's a Code Academy course on that. Let me go ahead and log into my Code Academy account and take a look at these courses. And I opened up the course, and all the lessons are in gray. And I was like, what? Why are they all in gray? And I go to start one, and it starts at 4:59 right at the end of the lesson. What's going on here? I had completed all 100 hours of that course, start to finish, had a perfect rating, answering every question correctly. I remembered 0 of it 2 years later. I was just learning a ton of different things. I was hopping frameworks repeatedly, and that was just enough that the retention rate on that information was 0. And that's not the end of the world. It didn't mean that I wasn't suited to be a software developer or that I was never going to do Angular. It was just if I felt like, hey, learning some framework for a few months, hopping onto another thing and learning it for a few months, at the end of a year, I wasn't really any place. The only thing I just learned the last framework for a few months. That was the only place my knowledge had increased at all. And the other stuff was really just sort of lost. And so, yeah, that was an issue. The other thing that really was difficult, or that was sort of a thing that I tried that did not work well, is when speaking to people on the development team, and I said, hey, I'd be interested in moving over and doing a development role, I would hear a response that was something to the effect of, just go to the hiring portal and apply there. And that, what I should have heard there was no. Because essentially, if, and you sort of know this in general, right? If someone says, hey, you should come and work for me, and you say, oh cool, I'd like to do that. And they're like, yeah, just give your resume to the hiring manager, and I'll talk to you later. It's like, that's not a very positive yes, right? That's not like, oh yeah, no, come meet the team, come have lunch with us, and I'll show you where the office is, and I'll give you a tour of what we do every day. And yeah, you got to give your resume to this person, but that's not like the only piece of that step. So in publishing, they call that like an over the transom, which was a little window over the top of a door people used to have, and it's like treating your application as if it's like just junk that got sort of tossed over your door while you weren't there is usually not that great. It's not that positive. And so, as much as possible, right, if somebody was really excited about you, they would generally try to work around that process or speak to you directly. But moving was difficult, and for a while it was a little hard for me to figure out why, especially when there would be kind of very junior or very sort of not super intensive development stuff that came up and was available, and I found it really hard to get that work inside New Relic. And the answer was pretty simple. I would talk to my manager, or my managers would talk to each other, and what my current manager had just been asked is, do you want this person to leave, right? Do you want to lose the use of this person? And their answer was no, right? And so moving inside a company is difficult because the benefit to you is clear. The benefit to the company is not always as clear. And so when people are paying you to do something, they generally don't want you to stop doing that and do something else. And so, yeah, this will come up when you try to do an internal move, when you try to be promoted, when you try to work at doing something different inside of a single company. But here's the stuff that did work. And the number one on that list is huge. So the first game jam events, if you're not familiar with them, are programming events where people try to produce a complete piece of software or game experience in about 48 hours. And there are ones that are super unpleasant and generally exclusionary, where sort of everybody gets together and works in one room and it smells terrible. And but there's also ones where it's just, hey, we're going to try and do this event. There's sort of an online like coordination. It's very, there's maybe assistants finding other people to work with in teams. You can work on your own. You can meet up in a spot. And the first one of those I did, I was very passionate about programming. I was studying a lot. What I could actually contribute to that team of 4 people that formed up was just like building models in Blender, building little 3D models and drawing stuff in Photoshop. Both stuff that I did just sort of okay. But I did, I made a few tiny little code commits, and I got to use GitHub in my own project for the first time. And by the end of my time at New Relic, I'd done 13 of these game jam events, so 13 different weekends over the course of about 3 years. And they were really fantastic at giving me a chance at really seeing what making software is like, which is not so much that all software gets done in 48 hours, but just rather than working on a personal project for 9 months where maybe I noodled around and went back and changed stuff, and all that stuff was fine because it was my personal project. It was very much about defining the features that we needed to implement, taking a look semi-constantly to see, like, are we on track to release those features at this very close deadline that we have, coming back at the end of a first day and saying, hey, what's working, what's not, what do we absolutely need to do to get this thing out the door, and then trying to end up with something that you could really be happy with. And that was just a fantastic insight into, like, how stuff actually gets made and like what tools you're really going to use. And every single time I did that, I generally felt like, whatever levels there were in programming, that I was up one of those levels each time I completed one of those events. Personal projects was great, and also just contacting other developers and saying, hey, this is what I want to be doing. What can you tell me, or what direction can you give me? None of that was as straight a line as I would have liked it, but it all helped, and it was all super helpful in my development. So here was the worst moment of ever being at New Relic, which was sitting in the lunchroom after having interviewed for a role on their Node team and hearing this about the job search. Someone said, hey, that last candidate, he finished this puzzle in 23 minutes, and that's like 2 minutes better than the record. I happen to know how long it took me, which was about 33 minutes, or maybe it was 38 minutes, but I knew at the time it was like I was like 8 minutes longer. And there's so many things that were weird about that moment. First of all, that was how I found out I didn't get the job. But also, I guarantee you that actually programming is not a race, right? If you get the person who types the fastest or solves these puzzles the fastest, they are not the person who is the best developer. And everybody sort of knows that, but when you do this and you give this test to everyone who comes in, it's going to be very hard not to hire the person who had the shortest time. So that was a tough moment. And the company that I was working at was very successful, and they had a lot of ability to command some very, very great people. The person they ended up hiring, I believe, was the person who had this record time, was also like a core committer in Node. And so they had, written the core software that they were building products for now. So it was very understandable that they made that choice, but also that, that meant I had to sort of broaden my horizons as to where I was going to look to work. So let's talk about my third job. That's not Max, that's Minerva. This was at Vacasa, which is a shop here in town that does it's like a more boring version of Airbnb. It's like you sign up, they directly manage your beach house or what have you. Like Vacasa directly employs the maintenance people and everything. So it's a somewhat more traditional business, but anyway, they had this big online thing. So they offered me $58K, I got it up to $62K by pushing extremely hard. Which, if we remember back, is a massive pay cut from what I was making a few weeks before. But I was a full-time developer, a PHP developer. I want to tell you that if you've been working on your own projects and you've been kicking out features day in and day out in Ruby or in Node, you will notice the transition to PHP. PHP is a totally workable framework, and you can do anything in it that you can do in any other framework. But man, oh man, sometimes it's a lot harder. And it can really impress you with how difficult it is, especially with a project that's been around for a long time. Generally, that means that most PHP developers, especially those working in production, actually have a ton of knowledge and are quite capable. But yeah, it's a much more difficult framework to work in, and it can feel very frustrating to work in. So here's the stuff that didn't work, is that I felt like that at the time, so I didn't actually get that super into PHP development. So I'm not someone, you know, when it's my job to do something all day, I'm not necessarily going to go home and do it all night as well. But there was really no point when I said, hey, I'm a PHP developer now, I'm only going to read about PHP stuff, I'm going to stop running a Ruby meetup, I'm going to stop doing all these Node projects, I'm just going to work in PHP now, and I'm going to focus on that. And then the other thing I did, which they liked perfectly well, was I started building tools and microservices for them in Node, which they were perfectly happy with, but was not super effective for my own growth and development. And that was because of a pretty basic problem. I felt like I understood Node really well and like I was really good at it, but not having any kind of, not even senior developer, but any kind of contemporary with which to compare notes and be like, hey, is this the right way to do this? Hey, is this like smart? Like, you know, my pull request would go out and they would get approved as like, yeah, the feature works, like you said it did. But there was nothing back and like, yeah, don't do it this way. So that was tough. That was extremely tough. And I definitely did that to myself. Like if I just sort of focused on what everybody else was, like the language that everybody else was working in, I could have, you know, gotten a lot more code feedback and that good stuff. But it's not what I did. I didn't really want to work in PHP my whole life. So that's where that ended up. The other issue with Vacasa, and by the way, if you're considering a job offer at Vacasa, take it. They're a great shop. They're incredibly supportive. They have a really fantastically diverse workforce, and I really appreciate working there. Stuff that did not work well for me was a moment like this, where I said, hey, I didn't do anything this week. I didn't have any PRs out this week. And that was a meeting where I was not in trouble at all. And I was not fired. and it was also, not that I wanted to get fired, but that I wanted that to be like, we have a problem here, right? Like either the feature needs to be redefined, or you need more support, we need to change how we're implementing this, there's some kind of problem here. But the reality, it was like, that's okay, cool. Well, I hope you get some features done next week. And that was tough for me. For me, that lowered expectation meant that my production slowed. So the stuff that did work, oh, I did put it in here, cool. So I did maintain an active job hunt. I actively maintained features and you know, like kept my resume updated, kept adding stuff that I was currently working on. And that was really smart because at the end of a certain amount of time, I felt like, hey, this other job offer looks really good. So I got a fourth job. Man, he's cute. I got a job as a backend developer with a local marketing site shop that did like contract work. I got fired. I got fired after working there for 9 days. And I didn't even kill anybody. But here's the short version. A friend of mine a couple months later said, hey, I'm considering to work at the same place. And I said, yeah, they're great. They're good people. I just wasn't a good match to the skills that they were really expecting me to have. Fundamentally, I had learned programming starting in games, and my like web dev experience, while totally reasonable, had a lot more to do with programming than it did with web development. And those are similar, they're like kind of related, but a lot of the people who worked there could get a website up and built in a morning, right? Often that site was like fairly static, had no login or database connection at all, or it had very limited database connectivity, but it was up, it was done, right? And that was just not where my skills were. So when given like a task to do some Ruby site thing, I was like, oh, okay, cool. What's the most efficient way to do this so we don't have any N+1 errors, or we don't, oh, okay, how's this caching? Okay, cool. All right, so how do I debug this later though? I wanna log some stuff out. And like, other people at the same shop would have stuff out that day. So yeah, so that wasn't great. Principally because I was the sole earner in a family of 4. And so my options were pretty limited at that point. I had to get a new job pretty quickly, and I had to figure out what was the next thing I was gonna do. And since I'd left my last job relatively precipitously, so not after being there for 4 or 5 years, my dev resume at that point didn't look that great, right? It looked short. So I did something which I really didn't want to do, which is I took another job contracting. Full Stack Labs was also a contract shop, also working in a metered by the hour environment, and that was tough. I was making $35 an hour with no benefits. And however it worked out, they regularly paid me for less than 40 hours in a week. So a question that I repeatedly got while making this amount of money was this. So what's done? What's finished? It's 10 o'clock in the morning. What's done today? So very low paying, very, very fast paced. And I stuck it out for the time that I needed to make my bills and figure out the next thing. And one thing I do want to mention is that they attempted not to pay me when I left. In fact, this guy, David Jackson, asked me, why do I need to pay you $1,000 that I owe you? Almost 2 months after he owed it to me. If you'd ask, what does this have to do with the topic? This is going to be in every presentation stack I ever give from now on. If you think paying me after 2 months means that we're square, you're close. So the next job I got, so here's some of the benefits to contract work, and they are actually pretty considerable. You get a ton of exposure to new frameworks, and that's fantastic, because when you go to submit a conference talk, or you go to talk in a meetup, or even sort of have an interesting conversation, it's tough to talk about the thing that you work in every single day, right? You know all these little subtleties about it, you know all these weird bugaboos, and oh, jQuery 6 has this thing with capitalization, with XML attributes, and when you pass it into Cheerio, then you get this blah, 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 blah. But if you worked as a contractor and you're like, yeah, the thing about Bookshelf is, right? You always know kind of a little blurb about it. You've tried it out a few times. You know sort of its general shape. You're sort of this nice beginner in a large number of things. So for that stuff, contracting is great. It also, they made me build 2 Angular sites in 9 days, or whatever, super short timeline. So when I went to look for the next thing, I had recently built an Angular site. And I could grab and anonymize that code and serve it up as a code example. And that was super nice. So as far as finding the next thing, it was great. So let's get to where I am now. I haven't been here for super long. But I work at NWEA. I'm not sure what the E stands for, or the A, but I know we're in the Northwest, so I'm good there. NWEA is a nonprofit that does assessment and skills training in schools. And actually, PPS here uses NWEA, and they're quite happy with them, which is awesome. I make $45 an hour. I still don't get any benefits, but I can afford to buy my own, which is fantastic. I also get paid for 40 hours every single week, whether or not I work hard or not, which is just great. Totally love it. And occasionally, I'll get super into something and want to fix it, and I'll get all into debugging it and looking at other stuff. And I'll look around, it's 6:15, there's no one there. The office is completely dark, and that's just fantastic. And that stuff, when you look at working at something for weeks and months and years, that stuff really starts to add up. When it's no one emails you after work, nobody calls you, there's something breaks, we'll fix it tomorrow. Fantastic. So, did I actually learn anything other than that babies are adorable? I didn't realize that's Maxwell's Arm in there, the next image. Okay. So it is pretty easy to get discouraged. And for sure, after getting fired, I was kind of discouraged. Also, while I was at Picasa and my skills weren't growing very fast, it was easy to get discouraged. When I realized that at Picasa I was learning less than when it wasn't my job to do development, that was a moment when I felt super bummed. But it's really important to take a somewhat longer perspective than this week, right? Or even this month. If you look at where I am on a 4-year window, that looks great. Something I didn't even really talk about too much is when I was at New Relic working as a support person, I was very well paid. How many well-paid support people were there on Earth, right? The number I was able to figure out was I was definitely in the top 5% of all support people. And it was possible that there were maybe 1,000 other people in the country who were paid more than me for the same job. So that, when you take a longer perspective of what I do right now, looks great, right? And so it's important to try and stretch your frame out a little bit and not be quite as bothered by, like, you don't make as much as this other person, you didn't get a conference talk this month, people rejected your proposal, whatever else. Like, yeah, that is true, but you want to stretch the frame as much as you can. So in general, right, like this is this thing that we all sort of know, but we don't really talk about, right? Is that, the ones I know about are programming, mining, and healthcare. That are all things that will need like 20% more employees in 10 years, right? So like, if you look at the number of graduates, there will be 5% more job seekers and 20% more open positions in 10 years. So, you know, these industries are easier to work in than things that are not growth sectors, which shouldn't really surprise any of us, right? Like, we know that it's easier to get a job programming than as a tenured professor, right? Like, these things aren't surprising. And you also can sort of assume, like, there probably won't be 20% more like college educators in 10 years than there are now. But there are definitely some terrible programming jobs, which was really pretty impressive. One time, as like just kind of being curious about a framework, I took a job like through like WeWork and got paid like $40 to work for a day. And I was like, wow, there's some really terrible jobs out there. I see people out of you know, who've completed like boot camp courses being pointed over to like, this is what you should go work on WeWork or something. And it's like, yeah, you should not make, you know, $28,000 a year as a developer. That's not that cool. But those jobs do exist. So just because there's a ton of demand, there's a ton of competition, there will be people doing jobs that are terrible and that don't reflect sort of where demand is or where the industry is. So in general, like, this is a sort of a truism from the prehistory of American industry, but it's entirely, sometimes it's listed as to get a raise or to get a promotion, you need to change jobs. So like, in general, wherever you're working has a very simplistic vision of where you'll be working next. A lot of places, frankly, have no vision of where the company will even be in 3 years, and certainly not where you'll be in 3 years. So often they're even more short-sighted than that, but if they have a vision for you, it's really just to become a more advanced version of whatever it is you're doing right now. And so to move on to the next thing, you're generally gonna need to switch jobs. And that is weird. It is like, it's almost like a cognitive bias on the part of companies, right? Because you can literally leave your job, get paid a bunch more, have them have to go find your replacement, and then they'll pay the replacement a bunch more. But if you could have come into your office with a hatchet and they would not have paid you more, right? There's no way to convince them, like, you need to pay me more. I suppose the only rational explanation for that is most people, when you're asking for a promotion, for a transfer, for more money, they don't think you'll actually leave, right? And you do need to focus a little bit. You cannot, like, a bunch of programming fields are relatively easy to get started in, thank you, and they're relatively easy to get sort of a very basic education in. So it can be very tempting to just sort of keep flipping through, you know, Code Academy or Udacity or something. Not Udacity, fuck Udacity, but you know, everyone I know who does great like educational content has had their content stolen on Udacity and put up for sale by someone else, and Udacity like goes and resolves it 4 months later. So after paying that person all this money, and they don't give the original, yeah. So yeah, so but you know, it can be very tempting to be like, oh, I'll go do this basic Angular thing, I'll go do this first React project, I'll go build this Arduino thing, I'll go do this machine learning thing, and you do need to focus a little bit. You need to have, in general, sort of a topic that you're pushing towards. And here are the things that I do think that it would be nice if pretty much everybody took the time to study. And I'm sorry that that text is so tiny. Let me go ahead and fix that. That's too tiny. Everything except for me making fun of Full Stack Labs, again, that's Full Stack Labs, will be up online because I did sign something saying that I wouldn't slander them, which doesn't cover stuff that you say in a presentation. It does cover stuff you publish. So that slide will be gone, but the rest of these slides will be up online later today. But so here are the things that I think you should cover if you're saying like, hey, I want to be a developer. And obviously, like, if you have a target that's not based on websites or, you know, isn't, you know, that you want to do science stuff or other stuff, please go do that. I don't have a path for everyone. But if you're interested in something around web development, game development, that kind of thing, here are the things that I think you should have some knowledge of. One is some knowledge of Linux, some knowledge of databases, basic flow control, so that would be loops and ifs and statements, functions, sort of general ideas of programming. Something that is in some way a web server. And then one kind of you pick turbo nerd thing that you get to do. So a little more specific on those resources. So for Linux, I absolutely love the book, The Linux Command Line. I'm sorry I don't have the name of the author in here, but here's his site, linuxcommand.org. His book is up for free. It's fantastic. For databases, you can do any database. I'm not saying you have to do this, you have to do Postgres, but Postgres, I feel, has lovely online documentation, has really good, especially the tutorial docs, or not tutorial docs, but like guide documents they have are great. Much, much better than a lot of the other open source stuff out there. You can take a look at Code Academy for any language you want to do some kind of flow control. And again, for a web server, probably that follows from what language you picked, but yeah, that's again is sort of your choice as to what you're most interested in. And then let's talk about turbo nerd stuff. So that's my dog, Jake. Wait, no, that's Leo. Sorry, I had a dog named Jake, but he barked too much. Anyway, this is Leo. So here's some, so a turbo nerd thing is you need to have something that you understand really well, that when people are talking about it, you can be like, hey, I have some knowledge to offer on this that isn't directly related to what it is your job to do, or sort of directly what you imagine you're gonna be doing. And so here are some options that I think are useful. One really good example is the book JavaScript, The Good Parts, which covers why when you do 1 in quotes plus 5, it makes 15, and why you do 1 plus 5 in quotes, it makes 6, right? That's not stuff you need to know to be a web developer, but it is a cool book to read to learn a bunch of turbo nerd stuff. Regex is another good example. You could write some shaders. That's a very Python thing to do. Machine learning, doing some Arduino stuff. You could look at file compression or cellular automata. Those are all things that I think it's very easy to get passionate about, and it's really fun to spend some time on them. And it's very nice to have sort of something to mention or sort of a comfort zone that you have that's sort of not directly just job related. Okay, cool, that's my talk. Let's see, do we have question cards? Anybody have question cards? Which I'll take a look at now. But yeah, thanks for coming otherwise.